Ross R.
McKittrick, yes.
No paternity leave, Brendan? Oh, congratulations.
Bonjour, collègues.
Good morning, colleagues. I hope you had a good rest week in courts. Good morning, witnesses. Thank you for being here this morning.
It's in a hybrid format and is in public. We have witness testimony for the full 2 hours. For those in person, please follow the health and safety guidelines for using earpieces written on the cards found on the table. Le comité reprend son étude de l'efficacité.
The committee is resuming its review of the effectiveness, potential improvements, and capacity of Canada's 2030 emissions reduction plan.
Meeting with the following witnesses. Professor Ross R. McKittrick, who is by video conference, and from Efficiency Canada, Senior Director of Policy Strategy, Mr. Brendan Haley.
Monsieur le Président, désolé, je n'ai pas de...
Pardon.
Mr. Chair.
Est-ce que vous êtes sur le bon canal
Are you on the right channel?
de vérification?
Let's do some checks.
Testing. Testing. Bon matin. Parfait. Est-ce que vous avez entendu les noms ou est-ce que vous voulez que
Did you hear the names, or do you want me to repeat them?
go straight to opening remarks and after that questioning witnesses? So, chacun des témoins dispose de 5 minutes.
Each of the witnesses will have 5 minutes for their opening remarks,
Which says you have 1 minute left, and after it says time is up. So that's when the clock stops ticking. So I'll start with Professor Ross McKittrick. The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I hold a PhD in economics from the University of British Columbia, and since 1996, I've been a professor of environmental economics at the University of Guelph. In the early 1990s, I developed and published one of the first computable general equilibrium models of the Canadian economy, focused on modeling CO2 emissions and climate policy. Since then, I've published over 100 peer-reviewed academic papers and think tank reports on all aspects of climate change. During the Chrétien government years, I took part in multi-model assessments of the potential impacts of meeting Canada's Kyoto Protocol commitments. In those days, there were multiple published cost estimates from a diverse group of modeling teams, including Finance Canada, Natural Resources Canada, and Infometrica. The work was coordinated by a federal entity called the Analysis and Modeling Group. By contrast, the current government has provided no information regarding the costs of meeting the Paris target. Neither Finance Canada nor NRCan have reconstituted the Analysis and Modeling Group, and to my knowledge, there are no published official cost estimates for the Federal Emissions Reduction Plan, or ERP. The ERP itself simply waves away the cost issue with vague promises of economic benefits from implementing the plan. I have published quantitative estimates of the costs of the ERP, or at least those elements that the government specified in enough detail to model. For this work, I developed a new, highly detailed computable GE model of the Canadian economy, which I have published in the peer-reviewed Canadian Journal of Economics. I estimate that the plan will get Canadian greenhouse gas emissions down by a little over halfway to the 2030 target, but at a cost of about 6% of Canada's gross domestic product relative to the base case. Note that the economy continues to grow, but at a slower rate. The carbon price is the cheapest and most effective component of the ERP. I estimate that by 2030, it would have reduced greenhouse gas emissions by about 18% compared to 2019 levels, and it would have reduced GDP growth by only about 0.1% per year. The Clean Fuels Regulation cuts twice as much off the growth rate as the carbon tax and only reduces emissions a third as much, while the remaining regulatory components, such as tightened building energy efficiency codes, the EV mandate, and so forth, are 3 times as costly as the carbon tax, while being only about 1/8 as effective at reducing emissions. And as you all know, the first thing Mr. Carney did after getting elected was to eliminate the consumer carbon tax. Whatever emission reduction policies are retained between now and 2030 will be costlier and less effective. But rather than go into further details about macro modeling results, I would like to turn to a simplified version of something called the Kaya identity, which breaks down annual CO2 emissions into 3 components: the emissions intensity of GDP, or emissions per dollar of output, real GDP per capita, and population. It shows that, to a close approximation, the annual percent change in CO2 emissions growth is the sum of the annual percent changes in emissions intensity, income, and population. In a report for the Fraser Institute in 2024, I showed how these 3 metrics have changed since 2005 and what the outlook is through 2030. In the figure accompanying my remarks, I have updated the numbers from the original sources to 2024. Canada's CO2 emissions changed very little, falling by less than 3% over the past 25 years. On our current trajectory, we are nowhere near meeting either the 2026 or the 2030 targets. Emissions intensity declined by about 40% since 2005, and for 20 years it has been falling by about 2% per year. It does not exhibit any apparent sensitivity to government policy. Instead, it is mainly driven by improvements in energy efficiency, which depend on long-term technological change. Real income per capita rose by about 19% over the past 25 years, which is a worrisome trend if your goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But fortunately, government policy succeeded in stopping its growth after 2022, and there is little prospect that Canadians' real income will rise again in the foreseeable future. Finally, population growth has accelerated to about 3% annually, 3 times its historical rate. Remaining committed to the 2030 Paris target will require an emissions cut of 36% from 2024 levels, so about 6% per year. If population growth goes back to 1% annually and emissions intensity continues to decline at 2% annually, all we require is for the government to ensure that real income per capita declines in Canada by about 5% annually for the rest of the decade. While I believe that outcome is within the capability of the present government, I do not recommend it.
Thank you very much. And we will start now the questioning. We will start with the Conservative Party for 6 minutes. Mrs. Asti, please. Oh, sorry. I guess I needed more rest for my week off. Sorry about that. We'll give you an extra couple of seconds just for that little error. So, Mr. Brendan Haley, the floor is yours. Thank you for 5 minutes.
Thank you. So given the topic of the committee, I first want to say improving energy efficiency reduces greenhouse gas emissions. So a Dunsky Energy and Climate Consultant study estimated it could have contributed 25 to 35% of Canada's 2030 goals. A potential study by the International Energy Agency showed that energy efficiency could contribute 40% to Canada's energy needs in 2050 and make a similar percentage contribution to a net zero reduction goal. But what I mostly want to talk to you about today is all the other benefits of energy efficiency, particularly when it comes to a more productive and self-reliant economy. So saving energy, it can do the same thing as building a power plant, and often does it at lower cost. So for example, Hydro-Quebec recently published that it would cost it about 4 cents to save a kilowatt hour of electricity versus supply-side costs of 13 cents. So the Prime Minister's mandate letter calls for nation-building projects, and the discussion so far is focused on more physical infrastructure like pipelines, transmission lines. So I want to give you 5 reasons why I think adding energy efficiency to Canada's portfolio of nation-building projects would be a good idea. So first, it directly improves productivity. It means more GDP for every unit of energy consumed in Canada, with estimates of $4 to $7 of an increase in GDP for every $1 invested. Second, it can produce results in, say, 1 to 2 years. That's faster than any mega project I know of. It's also highly adaptable. So unlike a power plant, which has very fixed processes, rigid supply chains, it's possible to save energy across all sectors using multiple technologies, and we use engineering expertise, which can navigate around potential supply chain challenges. Third, it supports Canadian businesses and innovators. Energy efficiency, it's a very made-in-Canada energy option. It's found within our borders, it's found in our homes and industries, but then when we look at some of the materials used, things like insulation, things like fresh air equipment, they're largely manufactured in Canada. We have Canadian companies building internationally competitive businesses and innovating in areas like smart thermostats, pump and motor systems, natural refrigerants, carbon sequestering insulation, and heat exchange. With respect to intellectual property, industrial energy efficiency is the largest category of clean technology patenting in Canada. Building energy efficiency is the 4th largest category. It can also be a very tariff-proof and cost-cutting solution for industry. So if we look at, say, energy management systems, they use data to optimize industrial operations. They can often extend the life of existing equipment. So that can prevent a business from, say, having to make an emergency equipment purchase, which can be quite attractive right now. A 4th reason, energy efficiency is regionally fair. Energy savings are found throughout the country. And then finally, energy efficiency, it directly supports people in their homes and their businesses. So one way we improve energy efficiency is we make the choice to, instead of paying for power plants, we pay people to improve their efficiency to use less energy. That's, again, often lower cost than power plants and transmission lines. And so I would rather pay people instead of pay power plants. So my recommendation is to incorporate energy productivity and affordability into Canada's climate plan by making energy efficiency a nation-building project. That can be defined based on 2 goals. First is an energy productivity goal to double the pace of efficiency improvement. That would be measured by the amount of energy used to produce a unit of GDP. And second is an affordability goal, which should be eliminating energy poverty along with achieving net zero emissions. So these goals would define a nation-building agenda, one based on self-reliance, affordability, productivity. It would use local knowledge, use local businesses, and it would also reduce greenhouse gas emission reductions, or greenhouse gas emissions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. 1 minute short, then time allocated. That's great. You'll have more time for the members to ask questions. So the floor is yours, Mrs. Astip. Thank you for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Ross McKittrick, for your opening statements. Lots of technical language in there, but there's a point that you've made at the end of your opening remarks that I think is really important for Canadians to understand. And what I was thinking about as you were talking about your position is that a term I like to use in business, the juice is just not worth the squeeze. And you've pointed out that measures like the emissions cap and others only reduce emissions by about 2.3% annually, yet there's a serious cost to our economy and household incomes. Can you expand a little bit on what that trade-off means for Canadians and their everyday lives?
Yes, that is an important point I tried to get across, that different policies have different cost and effectiveness ratios. And unfortunately, the way the emission reduction plan was put together, the government listed, I believe, 140 different measures. And what they didn't do, though, was provide any cost information on those measures. And so they're leaving Canadians in the dark. They all sound good on paper, but when we engage in this kind of analysis and modeling work, it does become very clear that some of them are going to end up being extremely costly and largely ineffective at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So we could look at, well, the clean fuels regulation would be an example where if the carbon tax, if the government that implemented the carbon tax really understood the logic of the carbon tax, they would also realize there is no reason to bring in the clean fuels regulation on top of it. The economic logic of the carbon tax is such that you don't need these other regulations. If you really believe in the measure, what you end up doing is just trying to micromanage businesses and households across the country. and it's a temptation on the part of government. I think one of the overarching points that I was trying to make was that this government has really left people in the dark about the costs of what they're proposing. It is nothing like back in the days of Kyoto. There was, as I mentioned, there were 3 different independent modeling groups in the federal government working on detailed cost information. Nothing like that has happened, and so we're just asking Canadians to trust government policy proposals with no information about the impact on household budgets and businesses.
Thank you. I want to kind of bring this in specifically to a sector that's important to me, and I talk about it lots in this committee, and that is the Newfoundland and Labrador offshore. But also the Western Canadian energy sector also is a huge benefit to the people of Newfoundland and Labrador. So as an economist, do you think that the Liberals have overlooked how Newfoundland and Labrador economically benefits not just from Western Canada's energy industry, but also the offshore when they develop and propose these policies?
By offshore, are you referring to offshore oil and gas?
Yes.
Yes. Well, like the Western energy sector, the offshore oil and gas sector in Canada requires a stable investing environment, and it requires commitments on permitting, and it requires an environment that makes it possible to have a predictable profit profile for these significant investments. And by the government moving towards a much more regulatory intensive approach rather than a predictable, in this case, a carbon price approach, it's a disservice to the East Coast energy sector, but really to all kinds of sectors in Canada that have to engage in long-term, multi-decadal planning intervals. And during the past election, there was a lot of talk about the fact that we just don't see these projects being proposed. And even when the government set up this new office for nation-building projects, they didn't have a lot of interest coming from the private sector. And this is because the long-term planning environment in Canada is so unfavorable, and it's because of this regulation-intensive approach and also the lack of information from the government about the costs of the regulations.
Yeah, so just one quick point on that then. Would you agree then that this emissions cap that is meant to implement these targets risk stalling the economic and development? It merits a full rethink because it compromises our competitiveness?
Yes, I think that's true. And to single out one sector and say we're going to put a specific cap on your sector, but not other sectors, it guarantees that whatever you achieve in emissions reduction will be at a higher cost than it otherwise needed to be.
So based on your experience as an economist then, do you believe that this proposed emissions cap is more likely to cause harm than benefit?
Yes. And I would quote the government's own figures on their estimated social cost of carbon. And in the research I've done, it shows that this element of the regulatory structure is far costlier than their own estimate of the benefits.
Thank you. I'm sorry, time is up. Monsieur Saint-Pierre, la parole est à vous pour 6 minutes.
Mr. Saint-Pierre, you have 6 minutes. Thank you.
Your organization, Efficiency Canada, produces provincial energy efficiency scorecards. One, can you provide this committee with the most recent scorecard? And in the latest scorecard, some provinces such as BC or PEI scored highly, and other provinces such as Alberta were on the lower end. Can you speak briefly about the role of provincial governments in meeting our 2030 targets, or how it helps to reduce emissions to meet our targets?
Yeah, as you said, we do this every couple of years. We do a pretty comprehensive analysis of energy efficiency policies at the provincial level. Provinces have the ability to implement building codes. They usually run things called demand-side management programs, which make the decision essentially of, are we going to build a power plant? Are we going to build a transmission line? Or does it make more sense to do energy efficiency and save energy instead? So some of the provinces that are high in that scorecard would be, as you mentioned, British Columbia. It has a building code that is moving towards net zero energy on a very predictable timeline. PEI is a great case. PEI is a real leader in low-income energy efficiency programs to tackle energy poverty, and I spoke to that in my remarks briefly. I mean, the other thing, so definitely I can provide the committee with that. The other thing we do is we kind of look at those provincial policy systems, and we then think about, well, how can the federal government play a truly value-added role? And a good example of that is a recent federal program for low-income energy efficiency called the Canada Greener Homes Affordability Program. We looked at what are the provinces doing, what are they not doing, where can they use extra help. They could use extra help in things like deeper energy savings, fuel switching, like things like upgrading if you have asbestos or if you have mold, dealing with those issues, because an energy efficiency program at the utility level often can't deal with that. So I think that's a good example of the federal government being able to play a value-added role, being able to do things the provincial level can't.
Quick follow-up question. Your organization also provided a sign-on letter to the federal government about the Greener Homes Loan Program. So can you provide a copy of that letter to this committee? And can you speak to the importance of this letter or the Canada Greener Home Loan Program?
Thanks. Yes, I'm happy to provide a copy of that letter. So the Greener Home Loan Program, it was a loan that provides zero-interest loans. It was really the main way for middle-income households to improve their energy efficiency and improve their greenhouse gas emission reductions. As I said, there's this low-income program, which deals with specific barriers. But if you're middle income, a zero-interest loan works quite well. So unfortunately, that program was essentially shut down, or the intake was closed on October 1st. And the letter that you're mentioning was a letter written months before that saying this is a good program to recapitalize, especially because the kind of start-stop nature of a program like that is very disruptive for the people who do the work, to the businesses that have developed business plans around a loan program like that. It also really doesn't help consumers. Consumers should be taking advantage of that loan when it makes the most sense for them, when their furnace dies, when they're replacing their siding, not kind of chasing government grants because they know they're going to go away.
Great, thank you. Dr. McKirtrick, in 2002, you wrote a book called Taken by Storm, where in chapter 10 you said underneath the global warming issue is a general question of how to make good when the science is uncertain. One, can you provide a copy of that book to this committee? And secondly, do you still believe that the science of climate change is uncertain?
First question, I think I can. It's been out of print for a while, but I will see. On the second question, it's a very large issue. I guess I'd need you to specify. I've published on a lot of aspects of climate change, including some of the statistical issues involved. And yes, there's lots of, the journals are full of uncertain issues on climate change. I need you to be a bit more specific.
Running low on time, but there's an evangelical declaration on global warming from 2012. Did you sign on to that declaration?
I don't know. Again, I need you to be more specific. If I did, my name would be on it.
So it's this specific declaration with your name on it. The declaration says that we deny that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. Do you still deny that CO2 or carbon dioxide is a pollutant?
I deny that it's an air pollutant in the same category as carbon monoxide or sulfur dioxide. It's not regulated. It's not listed as a pollutant in that framework.
So you're currently a fellow at the Fraser Institute?
Senior fellow, yes.
Senior fellow. Is it true that the Koch Institute funded Fraser Institute in the past?
You would have to ask them. I don't know. I'm not privy to that information.
Does the Fraser Institute receive any foreign funding?
Again, you'd have to ask them. I'm not privy to that information. My salary is paid by the University of Guelph. I'm not a salaried employee there, but again, you can find out from them where their funding comes from.
Pierre, maintenant la parole est à Monsieur Bonnet pour...
Mr. Bonner, you have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. McKittrick, I'll continue in the same line of questioning. Could you tell the committee the income sources of the Fraser Institute? Inaudible for the interpreter.
1 second. Quand vous allez demander pour des documents, faudrait que vous...
When you request documents, you need to go through the chair. That way, the registrar would take note of the documents requested and make sure that the documents are received within the right timeline. If you do this way, we may not receive your documents in time. Mr. Chair, could you request that the income sources of the Fraser Institute be submitted to the committee? Thank you. Dr. McKittrick, to your knowledge, does the Fraser Institute receive money from oil and gas industries? To your knowledge.
I'm not involved in fundraising or budgeting. You'd have to ask them.
D'accord, merci. Je note votre...
Very well, your ignorance is noted. Mr. Haley, let me come back to the loans for innovation. These loans do not exist for the middle class. Do you think that this is a problem for our fight against climate change?
Services when they need them. And that means solutions for if you're middle income, if you're low income, and right now there's essentially no solution available from the federal government if you're middle income. And it's a bit of a mystery to me because it was a loan. Most of the money gets paid back. The fiscal cost was quite low. And so this kind of asset on the government books seems to be exactly the type of program that this federal government says they like, something that can be declared as an asset on the book and that you do pay a small interest rate subsidy. So it was a mystery to see it go away. The government right now is saying, well, it met its objectives, and I don't understand what the objective was of that loan program because all the buildings are not retrofitted. We haven't hit net zero in the building sector. There's still demand for the program. We haven't, transformed the market and created new business models. So it seems that the objective was to spend the money and then it's gone. So that's why one of the recommendations to my committee is to have some goals associated with energy productivity, but also some goals associated with energy poverty so that this low-income program that now exists doesn't just go away when the money runs out, that there's actually an objective associated with it.
Okay. Donc, pour vous, c'est un recul.
So you think this is a step back when it comes to our fight against climate change?
Absolutely. Getting rid of the Greener Home Loan Program is, not consistent with meeting net zero emissions. It also wasn't consistent with the promises made on the last Liberal platform, what Mark Carney wrote about in his book Values that actually identified home energy retrofits as a strategic and high productivity area for government investment.
Je voudrais revenir sur le
Let me come back to the Build Canada Homes program. In your opinion, should this include a condition concerning the construction of new buildings so that they respect the energy efficiency requirements?
That I've seen, no clear statement that as the government supports new homes, that there is going to be some sort of energy efficiency standard, associated with that. And so one thing the federal government could do is there's a national model building code, which the provinces adopt, and there's essentially a series of levels or tiers of that building code. The federal government could say, Build Canada Homes is going to follow a schedule of energy performance, moving up those tiers at exactly the same kind of schedule that we would like to see the provinces do. That would be a really productive way to make sure those buildings are essentially built right the first time so that they have low operational costs. It would also, I would argue, be a way to accelerate the modernization of the construction industry, because things like prefabrication, things like modular homes, they are also very good at hitting high energy efficiency performance targets, things like airtightness.
Merci. Est-ce que selon vous, une...
Thank you. In your opinion, a sector target for buildings of homes, will this help us achieve our GHG targets in Canada?
Targets should be based on exactly what we want. So one thing that hopefully we can all decide we want is let's eliminate energy poverty in this country. Nobody should be poor because of a high energy bill, because they can't access services like air conditioning. So I would really encourage, targets like that really can mobilize the public as well.
Now the floor will go to the Conservative. Mr. Leslie, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. McKittrick, the Liberals over the last decade have rolled out a laundry list of environmental schemes, but as you mentioned in your opening remarks, never have they told Canadians what any of it will actually cost, not to families, not to businesses, not to workers, and certainly not to the overall economy. As a professor of economics, holding a PhD, I'm hoping that you can help fill in some of the blanks on some of these specific policies. I'd like to start with the emissions cap. The government claims that it will not hurt Canadian energy producers. What do you think it will do to our economy?
I would first say that the burden of proof for that statement is on the government itself. And there are very competent economists within the government in places like Environment Canada and NRCan and Finance Canada who could generate information. And for all I know, they may even have done so. But that information hasn't been released to the public, which is a great disservice. As I've mentioned, imposing a cap on one specific industry that you don't impose on anyone else just guarantees that the cost of whatever you achieve has to go up. If the government trusted its own industrial carbon price and the output-based pricing system, if they understood the logic, they would understand that they don't need to supplement it with that kind of emissions cap. Now, in the specific case of CO2 emissions, it's very difficult to decouple fossil fuel use and CO2 emissions. That's not true of other emissions like carbon monoxide or particulates. You can decouple them. But CO2 emissions at this point is very difficult to decouple them. So imposing an emissions cap is very close to imposing a production cap. It may be possible at some point to engage in large-scale carbon capture and storage, but that isn't currently the case. So the emissions cap will ultimately, if it binds, turn into a production cap, and that, I think, has significant macroeconomic consequences, not only for the sector, but for the economy as well, given our reliance on energy exports.
Thank you. Now, we have heard the term energy poverty thrown around today, and I think it's a very real concern. Continuing on that vein of specific policies, the clean electricity regulations, do you have any sense as to how much this might drive up energy bills for Canadians?
Well, I have done a report in the Ontario case. One of the difficulties there is people will look at the generation cost of something like wind and solar, and they'll say, well, the fuel is free, so it's an inexpensive source of electricity. But you have to deal with the intermittency problem. And dealing with intermittency by saying, well, what would it cost to rely on wind and solar on a 24-hour-a-day, 365-day-a-year basis? Then you have to look into the costs of the storage facilities, and that's where the real cost drivers are in. So in Ontario, the provincial government brought in the Green Energy Act back in the middle part of the first decade of the century, promising that it wouldn't raise electricity bills. But we know that was not the outcome. The global adjustment has gone up considerably to fund, among other things, the cost of covering wind and solar FIT payments. My concern about energy poverty issues is that they do often conflict with climate policy goals. The climate policy goals need to be thought of in terms of minimizing the cost for the goals that are achieved. But once we get into these laundry lists of emission reduction plan type programs, the costs escalate very quickly while the effectiveness of the programs drops.
Thank you. Now, when officials from the Environment Department before this committee recently, I asked if Minister de Bruzen planned to back away from the 2030 emissions target, and they insisted that the department has not done that. Now, if that's true, the government will need to impose drastic new measures in the next few years to hit those targets. In your assessment, what would the economic fallout look like if we actually were successful in hitting those targets? And do you have any specific policies you could see the government undertaking to try to achieve that?
Well, as I say, our annual emissions growth is the sum of our population growth, income growth, and the change in emissions intensity. We can get emissions intensity down by about 2% per year, and that includes the benefits of improving energy efficiency. So it comes down to income and population growth. The government is also apparently committed to maintaining high levels of population growth. So I don't know how they reconcile their goal on emissions with their goals on population and income growth, given the limitation to improvements in energy efficiency on a year-by-year basis.
Thank you very much. Next, for 5 minutes, Mrs. Midima.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for being here both. My question is for Mr. Haley. I'd like to pick up on this conversation of cost versus savings or positive return on investment. I spent a long time focused on energy efficiency in Halifax and saw the massive amounts of savings that focusing on efficiency has. And in fact, I know you were very much involved with the inception of Efficiency Nova Scotia. We have an efficiency utility in our province, and it actually led to not having to build a giant power plant, which was its goal, and it's still here today. Our Halifax plan, our climate action plan locally, actually showed a gain in financial benefit over time because we had energy efficiency as required throughout the 30 years. So not only were we going to be winning financially in the end, but we're not going to increase energy demand provincially. We weren't going to need anything from the utility to be able to do that as the municipality. So can you dive a little bit deeper on the economic benefits of energy efficiency and how that plays into our 2030 target? Thank you.
Sure. As I said, there's a report that I think I referenced in what I provided to the committee that essentially did an economic impact study of improving energy efficiency, kind of at a moderate pace and then at a more aggressive pace. I don't remember the job figures, right? But that's where that improvement of $4 to $7 of GDP for every $1 invested in energy efficiency, comes from. So it has an impact again in, GDP. More economic activity for less energy use, more outputs for less inputs. That's an improvement in productivity. That's what energy efficiency will do for you. And you can decide how to use that productivity. You can use it for more economic growth. You can use it for greenhouse gas emission reductions. You can use it for lots of other purposes. I'd say the kind of state of the art in thinking about the costs and benefits of energy efficiency, and actually Nova Scotia is now kind of leading on this right now, is thinking that energy efficiency is at lower cost than power plants, is at lower cost than transmission lines. I would say that is a very important thing to consider when we think about electricity systems and the impact of, say, things like investment tax credits, which tend to be more supply side focused and not so demand side focused. So for instance, you're potentially encouraging more expensive electricity options if you're neglecting the demand side. But the other real benefit is things like less money spent on healthcare. If you help someone out of energy poverty, if can access cool temperatures in the summer, things like air conditioning, warmer temperatures in their home in the winter, that has health improvements, more improvements on healthcare, improvements in terms of productivity when you work in an office. That's energy efficiency that has fresh air coming in. So these are kind of what we call the non-energy benefits, and most people call them, they're the benefits that a lot of people really want out of energy efficiency. It's things like comfort, healthcare improvements, productivity improvements.
That heat pumps can save lives, right, in the extreme heat we've been seeing across Canada. And energy poverty rates are actually highest in Atlantic Canada. So we think about this a lot, especially where there's really good opportunity to fuel switch from home heating oil to a heat pump because so many homes are still on it in Nova Scotia, although that number is decreasing. Energy efficiency seems to be a little bit of like an unsung hero, you know, like we have solar programs, they're shiny, people want them. The new shiny always gets the attention. I wonder if in your work you focus on how to tell the story more loudly and in a compelling way to get people to really think about efficiency first, not just as a homeowner, but as government and as industry at large. Thank you.
It's a good question. I don't think we should ever try to make energy efficiency sexy. We should just double down on it. It's totally unsexy, but it is extremely practical, and it helps you on your bills. It helps you, live in a more comfortable home. So, one thing I mentioned in my presentation is, what we can do? We can pay people instead of paying power plants, and I think that makes a lot of sense. Instead of building a power plant, let's pay people to be more energy efficient. To deal with some of the variability issues of renewables, we can actually store wind in people's electric cars. We can store wind in people's hot water tanks, and we can pay people for that service instead of paying a power plant for that service.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Maintenant, la parole est à vous, Monsieur Bonnet, pour 2.
Mr. Bonnet, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. The fact that the government abolished loans for green renovations, you said it has an impact on consumers. It's a step back in our fight against climate change. I have an impression it's also a problem for industries that are working in that domain. Could you tell us more about that?
Announced the Greener Home Program, which at the time was a combination of a grant and a loan. They encouraged people to become energy advisors. They said, you can now build a career as an energy advisor. And what energy advisors do is they're the people who go into your home, they look around your attic and your basement, and they find where you can get those energy savings that make the most sense and at the lowest cost. And then, right, they encouraged companies that install insulation, that install solar, to ramp up, to staff up, to train people, right? That program has only been in market for a couple of years. The implicit promise was that this was here to stay, was that people could build careers, right, in this industry. And now all those businesses are quite disruptive. They're quite disrupted, especially the energy advisors, I would say. And so the next time the government says, hey, we're going to have a loan program and we want you to help us reduce greenhouse gas emissions, I think those businesses are going to be less likely to train people, to hire people, because they can't deal with, businesses have trouble dealing with that kind of start-stop.
Est-ce que vous craignez d'autres?
Are you afraid that there may be other areas where we step back when it comes to the fight against climate change? And do you think that there are specific things you could recommend to be included in the budget?
This low-income efficiency program is a positive step that the government has taken. It is funded much less than that loan program was funded, much less than that initial grant program was funded. So the question everybody's asking now, is that program to deal with energy poverty, to help low-income people, going to just go out? We're going to stop when the money runs out, or are we going to actually have a target associated with it, a goal associated with it, something like eliminating energy poverty, so that we know when that new program can, do its job?
Could you tell us if Canada is a leader compared to other countries when it comes to green buildings? Green buildings.
Canada has a really long history of leadership in building science, in terms of the science, in terms of the patents and the science and the technology of making buildings. Canada's been a real leader in that. In fact, Saskatchewan developed the first super energy efficient passive house. But other countries have kind of stolen that leadership. It was really Germany that has been led in passive house. So I would say it's a similar story to other industries. Canada has the knowledge, we have the science, but we don't necessarily have the policy mix to make us a leader and to make us, really develop businesses in this area.
Thank you very much, Mr. Haley. And now Mr. Bexty for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for being here today. I appreciate it. Professor McKittrick, you had a report in the Fraser Institute last year titled The Economic Impact of GHG Effects of the Federal Government's Emission Reduction Plan through 2030, and it showed employment impacts. These impacts were substantial. And under a full policy package, your model estimated 164,000 fewer jobs by 2030 compared to the baseline. Could you clarify which job categories or regions bear the largest impact?
Well, the detailed tables are in the report. Let's see, I have it here. So I should point out, first of all, that that's not unemployment per se. In this type of model, that's an equilibrium change. It means the demand for employment goes down. So there may be temporary unemployment. I would think, especially out west, there'd be temporary unemployment, but there would also be reemployment. I actually find some of the largest negative effects are in Ontario on employment. And in this case, again, it being a general equilibrium model, it tracks the secondary effects as well. The increase in the cost of doing business affects all regions of the country. But in particular, I found analyzing this as best I could, the complete package of policies being put forward by the government does have a big effect on the cost of doing business in Ontario. And that requires some relatively large employment reductions in order to clear the labor market. But Alberta and Saskatchewan also bear a significant burden, again, because of the shrinkage of the energy sector.
Clarifier further, drill into that a little bit. What kinds of jobs are you talking about in Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Alberta?
There, I would have to say that I do have industry level information in the detailed tables. I can provide them to you. I don't have them at my disposal. This particular model doesn't distinguish employment types in the sense of skilled versus unskilled workers. I don't have that level of resolution in it.
Just from your professional, would you think trades and engineering specialties or finance and healthcare?
This would primarily affect trades, blue-collar workers. The service sectors tend to experience much smaller macroeconomic effects from these policies.
Thank you. Canada already faces one of the lowest projected GDP growth rates in the OECD, and your data kind of reflects maybe some of the reasons why. Or your analysis. And in your view, does implementing an emissions cap on critical export industries risk deepening that stagnation?
That's a concern that I have, that not only do a lot of people work in our energy sector, but it's a massive component of our exports. And if we end up pushing back on that type of production, and as a result, we're not able to sustain the export volumes, then that's going to have a negative effect on our exchange rate, which will affect Canadians across the country. I know that's a live concern among people who analyze this. And again, I wish there was more detailed guidance from the government, because there are a lot of competent economists within the federal government who could speak to this. Yes, the emissions cap, as I say, it will turn into a production cap, and we need to understand that that's going to have far-reaching effects on our future growth prospects.
Could you comment, I mean, the emissions... There we go. Sorry, the microphone was challenging me. With the increased cost of doing business in Canada related to emissions taxation, where would you expect that investment to be going? You implied earlier there'd be a reduction in investment and there'd be a reduction in activity commensurate with that investment and a reduction in jobs. Where in the world is that investment going if it's not going to be done here?
The obvious answer there is the U.S. I mean, they've moved very quickly, for instance, on LNG export facilities and green lighting, new energy development. Yeah, the U.S. would be the primary destination.
Thank you. For 5 minutes, the floor is yours, Mr. Fanjoy.
Thank you, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. Mr. Haley, I want to direct my first question to you. Canadians are facing some rising costs, and it's created an affordability issue for which is felt most deeply by those in lower and middle incomes. And much of that affordability issue is driven by how much money they're paying for energy to heat their homes, to cool their homes, to get around, basic things. I'd like you to address, if you could, how energy efficiency, changing, using the technologies that are available to us today, how that changes the equation for affordability for Canadians.
Sure. Thanks for the question. So yeah, there's about 2 million households in energy poverty as we typically measured it. That's about 13% of households. Every single province is over 10%. Of their population is found in that situation. It's highest in Newfoundland and Labrador by the latest. So these are households that they really care about their energy bill. It impacts them when they see it. And when you provide an energy retrofit, I mean, a standard energy retrofit can easily reduce your energy use by 20%. A really deep energy retrofit can reduce your energy use by 50%. So it can make that bill affordable, essentially, right? But as I said, I think what's more important than that is that the other aspect of energy poverty is that are you getting adequate energy services? Are you able to actually heat your home appropriately in the winter? Are you in danger of extreme heat, right? That's another aspect of it, and so that we really shouldn't, forget about. And as I said, that can mean you pay for prescription drugs, that perhaps you didn't. That means you can afford food. That means, you maybe have lower healthcare costs, and all of us have lower healthcare costs. So those are, the effects. For middle income folks, I would say that what's more useful for them is stability, is a stable bill, right? And some of that stability also comes in, say, resilience against things like extreme weather, right? If the power goes out, can your home hold its heat? A more energy efficient home can actually hold its heat. So those are some of the issues I think we see in other types of households.
Thank you. What Canada, is slowly adopting technology. Some places are moving faster than others. I'm encouraged by heat pump adoption. I have one myself. Solar, we see more and more examples, but I think it's fair to say that Canada is moving too slowly, and the fact that we're not exceeding targets yet is a testament to that. Why is that? What are the policy levers that you think governments at all levels may be missing in order to help Canadian citizens, businesses, and the economy as a whole move faster?
I think the real thing we need to think about is changing business models and changing the way we actually do the kind of retrofit process, right? So the standard HVAC company, what they tend to do day to day is they respond to emergencies. Your furnace breaks down, they replace your furnace. Your air conditioner breaks down, you replace your air conditioner. And there's so much lost value in that type of business model. We could change that business model so that that person actually becomes more of a consultant. They plan for when your furnace is going to break down and perhaps replace it with a heat pump, right? They perhaps do the insulation and the air sealing before so that the heat pump can be right-sized. Those are the types of business models we would like to see, and I think that would be quite transformative. So, the government, instead of, providing simply just grants and loans, we should really be thinking about how do we try to encourage that type of business model change. How do we also perhaps not just think about retrofitting one house at a time, how do we think about what kind of economies of scale can happen when we retrofit, entire neighborhoods?
This puts an end to this panel, so I would like to thank the witnesses for their testimony today, and the witnesses are excused, and the meeting will suspend while we prepare the next witness panel. les améliorations possibles à la capacité du plan de réduction des émissions pour vers 30. The committee is meeting with the following witnesses. Mr. Damon Matthews, Professor, Concordia University, Interim Director, Future Earth Canada, and Mr. Ron Wallace, former member, National Energy Board, by video conference. So for the witnesses, when you see my yellow flag going up, it's this indicating you got 1 minute left, and this indicating time is up. So I will now leave the floor to Mr. Matthews for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair and members of the committee.
I'm happy to field questions in French. This committee has heard many perspectives and arguments over the past weeks, but despite the debate, I don't think we are actually debating whether the emissions reduction plan is too weak or too expensive. It seems to me that we're really debating whether Canada should have an emissions reduction plan at all, or indeed whether the climate problem is important enough to warrant action. And I think this is the fundamental barrier to progress. We are still debating the seriousness of the problem. That this is still happening is both a failure of the climate science community and a triumph of the oil and gas industry. Because if we all truly understood the gravity of the crisis and what is actually at stake, there would be no debate about whether Canada should act. There would be no question that climate policy measures in Canada are woefully weak. There would be widespread dismay that Canada's economic well-being remains so dependent on a source of energy that will become obsolete within our lifetimes. I don't think we would be sitting here debating the individual merits of a set of insufficient policy measures. We would instead be putting all of our minds to the challenge of how to drive down emissions, diversify our economy, and protect the most vulnerable among us from the climate damages that we will not be able to avoid. I'm a climate scientist at Concordia University, and I've spent the past 20 years researching the fundamental relationship between human greenhouse gas emissions and climate warming. I have acted as an IPC author, provided expert input to legal proceedings, and served on climate advisory boards. Because it's worth saying over and over, there is no scientific doubt as to the cause of climate change. We all burn fossil fuels to produce energy. This produces greenhouse gas emissions, and global temperatures will continue to increase until this stops. It is also becoming increasingly clear how dangerous climate changes can be. Global temperatures have now exceeded 1.3 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and on our current trajectory, we will breach the 1.5 degree temperature limit in about 5 years. But it doesn't end there. Every additional increment to global temperature increase will drive more severe and more dangerous climate impacts. These impacts are already visible all around us. Intensifying wildfires, floods, and heat waves carry the clear signature of a warming climate. What we are witnessing across the country is not a new normal. It is the beginning of a transition to global climate conditions that have not existed in the history of human civilization. There will be losses for everybody. The town of Lytton burned to the ground a few years ago. Though it pales in comparison, the ability to skate on the Rideau Canal is unlikely to survive another decade. And beyond the direct physical impacts, climate change is also a threat multiplier. Climate damages increase the cost of living, strain societal resources, and can feed social conflict and instability. Global food systems, freshwater resources, and commercial supply chains are all feeling the effect of rising climate risk. And all of this is alarming, but it is not surprising. The climate changes we are experiencing are very much in line with climate model predictions. What is surprising is that the scientific reality of our changing climate remains a subject of political debate. Given the growing threat that climate poses, I would argue that it is irresponsible to start rolling back the halting progress we have managed to achieve over the past decade. This is especially true given that there are so many policy options available that would enable real progress on emissions reductions while also benefiting our economy and well-being. Major infrastructure projects are key. The decisions we make now will set the trajectory for future greenhouse gas emissions for decades to come. Expanding our national electricity grid, electrifying transportation systems, and expanding renewable energy generation across the country would all direct us towards a thriving low-carbon economy. Subsidies and incentives are also needed to help Canadians make low-carbon choices for our buildings, residences, and transportation needs. If we do not align around the need for ambitious climate policy, we risk missing a tremendous opportunity. The benefits of climate action, not just in avoiding climate damages, but also direct improvements to cost of living, security, health, and ecosystems, far exceed the costs of inaction. We have an opportunity to set a course for a prosperous future and a stronger economy for all Canadians. And this is what strong and ambitious climate action can achieve. Thank you.
Mr. Matthews, and now Mr. Wallace. The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The November 2024 draft regulations that proposed an emissions cap on Canadian oil and gas is unquestionably an international policy outlier. No other oil-producing country, including Norway, which is often cited for its climate leadership, has implemented a sector-specific emissions cap for oil and gas production. These regulatory limits target a sector that is vital to Canadian GDP. There are estimates that the cap could shrink Alberta's economy alone by 11% by 2050 and reduce its government revenues by almost 10%. Today, my brief focuses on one consequence of the proposed Canadian emissions reduction plan, specifically proposals to produce decarbonized oil in Western Canada by use of carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS, projects. Proposed policies to decarbonize Western Canadian oil are not only wrong for the West, they are unfair and will incur harm to the Canadian national economic interest. These policies disincentivize investment in Canadian export pipelines. They also compel material capital investments and parallel subsidies for projects that have questionable economic and technical viabilities. One would expect Canada to have a consistent national energy policy. However, it appears that Canada is about to embark on two quite different energy policies, one for the East and one for the West. For new Western Canadian oil export pipelines, Canada is proposing to require that oil be decarbonized. Meanwhile, as federal legislation has banned tanker exports from the Northwest Coast, tankers bearing undecarbonized oil from offshore are freely allowed to ship oil into Eastern Canadian refineries. There are significant policy and cost implications here because Western Canadian decarbonized oil would have to be produced and transported to competitive world markets under a unique regulatory burden. Moreover, is oil produced and exported from markets from the Canadian Atlantic offshore region, for instance, from those production platforms, is that oil required to be decarbonized? Similarly, Eastern Canadian refineries continue to import oil from the USA in offshore jurisdiction, free from any comparable regulatory burdens. For instance, in October of this year, nearly 6.5 million barrels of West Texas, Saudi, and Nigerian crude will arrive at the refineries of Quebec City and St. John. Is this oil decarbonized? And are the emissions from refining or tanker transportation accounted? Significantly, if Canada does indeed adopt decarbonization as part of an emissions reductions plan, we do have the engineering talent and the expertise required to construct and operate such massive decarbonization facilities. Hence, it is not a question of whether we can decarbonize, but whether we should compel Canadian producers, aided by significant tax incentives, to funnel billions into CCS schemes. Recalling that in addition to the required front-end capital cost of some of these projects, estimated at from $16 to $24 billion, such massive projects would incur unavoidable operating costs. These are unrecoverable costs that Canada would impose on itself, and meanwhile, none of Canada's heavy oil supply competitors face these costs, and no other country is paying that cost. Can Canada afford this? There are material negative and economic implications for an emissions cap on Canadian oil that entail parallel consequences that decarbonization would pose. Fortunately, there are alternative methodologies that could represent a more pragmatic approach to CO2 sequestration. For instance, BC C-59 earmarked $12 billion in tax credits to reduce the upfront costs of investment in carbon capture equipment, but it specifically excludes a proven method for carbon sequestration to use CO2 enhanced oil recovery, or EOR, from eligibility from its carbon capture, utilization, and storage. In closing, I would say that Canada needs a consistent policy for emissions, not two. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Wallace. And now the floor is for you, Mr. Bexty, for 6 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, witnesses. I appreciate your time today. Dr. Wallace, I mean, you've spoken about the impact of decarbonizing oil. Could you expand a bit on, how that places in the impact of Canada vis-a-vis our competitors in the world? Where is the investment going to go, and what's going to be the impact on global production and global emissions?
Well, that's a very good question, and thank you for it, Mr. Bexty. I want to just touch on, pick up some points that Dr. McKittrick made earlier. Clearly, he indicated in his testimony that, and by the way, in the report that I submitted, the more detailed report that I submitted to you, I have shown some of those figures. I would refer you to that report. But it's clear, let me just echo Dr. McKittrick's comments. Energy economist, for instance, Peter Terzakian, estimates that the Canadian energy industry and governments have forfeited almost $70 billion Canadian over 15 years because of the discount on heavy oil related to our lack of pipeline access to international markets. So there's two components to the question that you've asked. It's how much the economy of Canada has suffered because of this lack of international markets. And of course, the total amount of money that is flowing from Canada into the United States. I believe there are some estimates that indicate over $700 billion has flowed out of Canada towards the United States. I want to just pick up on one other component to this question, and that is Dr. McKittrick mentioned the fact that very few government estimates are showing Canadians what the true direct costs of some of these measures will bring to them. And when we talk about energy affordability, the best way to deal with energy affordability is to reduce the price of energy. We're now looking at potential costs for decarbonization, which would have to be subsidized by the Canadian taxpayer. There are some estimates that indicate that those direct costs of subsidies may range from $1.1 billion up to $4 billion a year. That cost, that additional cost of decarbonization that would be imposed upon the industry,